Welcome once again to our discussion on principles of economics. And in our previous sessions, so far we have learned basically demand, supply, elasticity of demand and supply, and how to use those elasticity of demand concepts and demand and supply tools to analyze several implications of several government policies, right. Now, using the demand and supply, in our previous sessions we have also learned about market equilibrium. Now, in today's session we are going to understand what are the implications of that market equilibrium on social welfare, right. So, if you recall that we said that market allocates the resource efficiently, okay. And when we said allocation of resources, basically we were talking about how much of each good is produced, and then which producer produce it, and then which consumers consume it. So, that is basically the allocation of resources, and we said that market does this job efficiently using the single most instrument called price. Now, welfare economics basically studies how the allocation of resources affects economic well-being, right. So, first we look at the well-being of consumers, and then we look at well-being of producers, and we will take a sum of these two, and sum of producers and consumer surplus, we call it social welfare. Now, we will once again go back to our previous concepts that we have learned, willingness to pay. So, a buyer's willingness to pay for a good is the maximum amount that the buyer pays for that good. But please keep in mind, as we have learned previously, that willingness to pay, the maximum willingness to pay for a good, and what the buyer actually pays in the market, they are two different things. So, once again I repeat this, the buyer's willingness to pay is different than what the buyers actually pay in a market situation. Okay? Actual payment is decided by the market forces, that means by demand and supply interaction, right. And it also measures, when I say that willingness to pay, obviously we can understand by simple analogy that willingness to pay is always determined by how much value is attached for a particular good or service by the consumer. So, willingness to pay is considered to be buyer's value for the product or service. Now, we are taking a hypothetical example. Look at here, in this particular case there are 4 buyers. What are those? Anthony, Chad, Flea and John, and their willingness to pay for a particular product is 250, 175, 300 and 125. And what is the product? Product is an iPod, let us say. Now, using this willingness to pay, what we are trying to do, even though we have learned demand curve previously, demand, once again I repeat to give a more detailed picture of the demand curve, okay, how demand curve can be derived from the willingness to pay. Previously we learned the interpretation of demand curve, the demand curve, or more specifically the inverse demand curve. What we have learned, that it gives you, the inverse demand curve gives you what is the maximum willingness to pay for each and every unit of the product. Now, look at here what is happening. If price of iPod is 200 rupees, then who will buy an iPod and what is the quantity demanded? Look at here. Okay. So, what I am saying, that for iPod, these 4 individuals, they have these 4 buyers, they have 4 different level of willingness to pay, and the market price for the iPod is 200. So, obviously, Anthony will pay, Anthony will buy, Chad cannot buy, Flea also will buy, John also cannot buy, right. And how many units they will buy? Let us see. Anthony and Flea will buy an iPod, Chad and John will not, because their willingness to pay for the iPod is lower than the market price, which we assume to be $200. So, look at here. So, if the price is 301 and above, then nobody buys, because the maximum willingness to pay is given by Flea, and that is 300. When the price is in between 251 and 300, then Flea will buy. Okay. And how many quantity? How many units of iPod? Obviously 1. If the price is 176 to 250, then both Anthony and Flea, they will buy, and this is 2 units. When it is 126 to 175, again 3 consumers will be able to buy, and when this is 0 to 125, then all of them will buy, so 4 units. So, this is how we can get the demand for iPod at different level of the price. Now, if we plot this willingness to pay, that means how much quantity you would be able to buy at different level of prices, then we will get a function like this. Okay, look at this, what I am saying. So, basically this step function shows that when the price is 300 and above, look at here, when the price is 300 and above, then nobody is buying it. Okay. So, quantity demand is falls to 0, because maximum willingness to pay was given by only one consumer. So, that is why if it is more than 300, nobody will be able to buy. When it is 251 to 300, 251 to 300, in this range one individual will buy. Similarly, when it is 251 to 300, 176 to 250, then another individual will buy, 2 more individuals. Likewise, at different level we get a step function. Okay. All right. Now, you might be thinking that earlier we saw that the demand curve is a smooth straight downward sloping straight line, but here demand curve is a step function. Why this is so? This is happening because we have assumed only 4 consumers in the market. That is why we got this type of step function. Now, if you increase the number of buyers into 400 or 4000, as the number of buyers increases in the market, the number of steps also will increase, and they will become small tiny steps, and as the number of buyers increases to infinity, when there is infinite number of buyers, then you will get a smooth straight line. That means, you will not be able to realize the steps when there are n number of buyers in the market. That is how the demand curve is actually derived from the willingness to pay. When there are small number of buyers, then only we can see this type of step function. Okay. So, demand curve looks like a staircase with 4 steps, 1 per buyer. If there are a huge number of buyers, then like what we said, in a competitive market where there are n number of buyers and n number of sellers, we won't be able to see the steps, rather we will see a smooth downward sloping demand curve, right. That is what. Now, at any quantity Q, the height of the demand curve is the willingness to pay for the marginal buyer, and the buyer who would leave the market if P were any higher than the price. So, that means from here look at this 300 is Flea's willingness to pay, right. So, that means one buyer is buying at that price, and if it is higher than this, then this buyer will also leave the market, right. Now, look at this is Anthony's willingness to pay 250, and the moment price goes beyond 250, then Anthony leaves the market also, right. Similarly, these are all these are maximum willingness to pay for the iPod, 4 different customers and 4 different level of maximum willingness to pay, right. Now, let us once again understand the consumer surplus. If you recall from our previous sessions that consumer surplus, why this happens, why do the consumers they get surplus? Because there is a difference between their maximum willingness to pay and what they actually pay in the market, right. Now, look at this, the amount the buyer is willing to pay minus the amount the buyer they actually pay. So, willingness to pay minus price, because actual payment is decided by price decided in the market. So, willingness to pay minus P is the consumer surplus. Suppose the price is 260, then the consumer surplus for Flea would be 300 minus 260, $40. Okay. The other 3 customers, they get no consumer surplus because they do not buy. Okay. They do not buy, their 260 is higher than all the 3 remaining customers' willingness to pay. That is why when there is 260, only one buyer buys and then the surplus is 40. Please keep in mind that to enjoy a surplus, you must be able to buy the product. So, consumer surplus is then a concept relevant only for those buyers who are actually buying the product. That is also you have to keep in mind. Consumer surplus is relevant only for those buyers who are actually buying it from the market. So, total consumer surplus is 40, right. Look at this amount. Okay. So, when the price is 260, let us say this is 260, then only one customer is able to buy and then the consumer surplus is 40. So, maximum willingness to pay minus the market price, that gives this particular area, this green area is the consumer surplus for Flea. Next, you assume that instead let us suppose the price is now 220. So, obviously 2 customers will be able to buy it, and then what would be the consumer surplus for Flea? Now, this would become 300 minus 220 is 80, and for the next customer, for Anthony, 250 minus 220 is 30. So, 80 plus 30, this is going to be the total surplus. So, at a price 220, since 2 customers are able to buy it, if we add the consumer surplus for both of them, then we will get total surplus. If you reduce the price further, then what will happen? Then one more customer would be able to buy, and that is how your consumer surplus total amount will keep on increasing. So, what we have learned then, total consumer surplus is the area which is above the price line, but below the demand curve. That is exactly what we have learned earlier. Okay. So, CS with lots of buyers and a smooth demand curve, if you do that, then consumer surplus would be this. Let us assume that the price is 30. So, that means in the area above this 30 and below the demand curve is the total consumer surplus for all the consumers. This is what we have learned. Okay. At price 30, equilibrium quantity sold in the market is 15 units and the consumer surplus is the blue triangle, okay, above the price line, below the demand curve. All right. How you are getting it? Up to 15 units, the total willingness to pay would have been this entire trapezium kind of thing, but consumers are paying only the area of this rectangle 30 multiplied by 15. Therefore, this area, this triangle, the area of the triangle is the total consumer surplus. And how will you get it? From our 9th or 10th level geometry, we can easily calculate the area of a triangle, which is half into base into height. And how do you get the base? Base is very simple. As you know, this is 15 and this area only you have to find out. So, total up to this much is 60, okay. This much is 60 and then this is 30 and the remaining is 30. That is how half into base into height. All right. How do you get this 60? From the demand curve, you set a price at which demand falls to 0. So, then you would be able to calculate this. Look at this, this is a height. This is the total consumer surplus. Now, the question is, if price goes higher, there is a reduction in consumer surplus. When price was 30, this entire triangle was the consumer surplus. When price becomes 40, then consumer surplus goes down. Why this is so? Because if you think again, when price goes higher, what will happen? Some of the customers, they will leave the market. Probably their willingness to pay, maximum willingness to pay is lower than 40. That is why some customers will leave the market. The existing customers, they will buy less than what they were buying earlier. Look, earlier the quantity demanded, aggregate quantity demanded was 15 when the price was 30, but now when the price becomes 40, quantity demanded falls from 15 to 10. So, existing customers are also buying less amount. These are the two reasons for which consumer surplus goes down when price becomes higher. Some customers, they leave the market, that is one source for the reduction in consumer surplus. Existing customers, they buy less product, that is another source of this reduction in consumer surplus. Okay, two reasons. Look at this area, this fall because some customers, they leave the market. Okay. This is the first component, some customers, they leave the market. And second reason, some buyers who are still buying, but they are buying less. Okay. They are buying less. Falls in CS due to remaining buyers paying higher P and they are buying less amount, and that is the reason. Okay. They are paying higher, right. So, obviously, if you pay higher, your surplus will go down, no. And surplus, you will only be realized only the product that you are buying. interesting economic intuition that is happening here. So, those customers who left, they are not able to enjoy any surplus, because surplus will arise only when you buy it, you participate in the market process. Existing customers, first of all, they are buying less, so that means they will realize consumer surplus only for those units. Earlier it was 15, now it is 10. Similarly, the existing customers, they are paying extra also. So, obviously higher price means less consumer surplus, because consumer surplus is the area defined as your total willingness to pay minus actual payment. So, actual payment is going up means consumer surplus will go down. Okay. So, this is another example to calculate willingness to pay. Let me skip this part and then I will go to the next one. Similarly, you can take the reverse case. When price falls, consumer surplus will go up. This is the opposite case of what we discussed earlier. When the price was 30, this is 10. If price falls to 20, then your consumer surplus will go up. Why the consumer surplus is increasing? Because at 20, some more customers will enter into the market, existing customers will buy more product and they are paying less amount also. These are the reasons for which there would be an increase in consumer surplus when there is a reduction in price, just the opposite. Now, look at the cost curve. We said that what we have discussed, the cost and what is the relationship between cost and supply curve we have discussed earlier. That supply curve indicates the minimum price that the supplier wants to receive, and how the cost, the minimum price is decided by the cost of production, and that cost includes resource cost as well as the suppliers or sellers value of time. And again we have cost of 3 sellers in the lawn cutting business. So, that means when you are preparing a lawn, there these 3 fellows, these 3 suppliers, they are cutting the grass and making the lawn ready for your use, and these are the 3 customers. So, same concept is applicable. If the price is 0 to 9, no one would be able to produce this service. When it is 10 to 19, then there would be only one producer Jack who would be able to supply. Likewise, you have. So, again if you plot this, then this will be an upward sloping, that step function, just the opposite of the supply function. Okay. And why you are realizing the steps? Again, because here we have assumed only there are 4 sellers. If you increase the number of sellers, then this will again become a smooth upward sloping supply curve, which we have discussed earlier also. Look at this. This is what is happening, and we can also calculate the producer surplus is the price, that means actual price what you receive minus your cost or minimum price that you are ready to receive to supply that particular unit. Since each of these producers, they receive, since the producers receive higher price than their willingness to receive, they maintain some amount of surplus. Look at this. This is what is happening to the producer surplus. Okay. So, total producer surplus equals to the area, again we have to remember, which is below the price line and above the supply curve. All right. So, this is the surplus what we are talking about. This is the producer surplus below the price line, above the supply curve, that is how we measure. And when the price goes down, then what happens? Producer surplus go down. Just the opposite, when price goes down, consumer surplus increases, but producer surplus decreases, because some producers will leave the market at a lower price, they won't be able to supply the product. Existing suppliers, what they will do, they will supply less quantity and receive less price for each and every unit. These are the two reasons for fall in producer supply. So, some sellers leaving the market, existing suppliers, they are getting lower price. So, this is another example that we have given, all right. So, instead of increasing, in decreasing, if it goes up, then producer surplus will go up, that is what we are. When the price increases, what will happen? Some more producers may enter into the market, existing producer will supply more, and they are also receiving more price for each unit. These are the two reasons which can explain the increase in producer surplus when there is an increase in price. Now, this is the point that is more important to understand. Total surplus is basically, consumer surplus is the value to the buyers. That means, your total, as we said, the willingness to pay is attached to the value to the buyers. So, that means, consumer surplus is value to the buyers minus amount paid by the buyers. So, that means, that is buyers gain from participating in the market. Consumer surplus is the gain from the exchange. What is the exchange? Exchange in the market. Okay. Similarly, producer surplus is the amount received by the sellers minus cost to the sellers. So, if we add these two, this amount paid by the buyers is exactly the same as amount received by the sellers. So, these two terms will get cancelled. So, therefore, CS plus PS would become now, this is CS plus PS become total gain from trade in the market, or social welfare we can think about value to the buyers minus cost to sellers. Okay. Cost to the sellers. One thing we have to keep in mind, if we assume that in a market there are only two players, one is the buyer, another one is the seller, then this total surplus can be treated as social welfare. So, from this simple expression we can understand the social welfare is maximum if value to the buyers is maximum and cost to the sellers is minimum. So, that means, if at all market produces maximum social welfare, which type of market? We are talking about competitive market. So, that means, if we can show in a competitive market, this term value to the buyers is maximum and cost to the seller is minimum at the equilibrium price, then we can prove that competitive market equilibrium results in maximum social welfare, because that is nothing but summation of consumer and producer surplus. I will repeat once again, assuming in a market there are only two agents, one is a buyer, another one is a seller. So, their total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus CS plus PS, which is nothing but the total gain from the market, which is equals to value to the buyers minus cost to the seller. Now, at equilibrium price, at the market equilibrium, in competitive market equilibrium, if we show that value to the buyers is maximum and cost to the sellers is minimum, then we can prove that competitive market equilibrium results in maximum social welfare, or total surplus is maximized.